Okay, so in the first part of the guide, we looked at, what did we look at? We looked at, oh, I can't remember. What did we look at in the first, oh, mean, median, and mode. Um, Quartiles, right? Dividing the data into 4. So the second part of the guide starts to look at collecting data. Okay, so the first part is sort of analyzing, the averages and the median and dividing it up. Now we're going to look at how to collect it. So one important thing about collecting data is how reliable the data is, because it's kind of like if your buddy tells you a rumor, that's not very reliable, right? You're not getting the information from a good source. So you want to make sure that when you're collecting data that you get information from a reliable source. It's kind of hard to read here, but maybe I should have made this bigger, but the first part says decide which data source is more likely to provide reliable data. So the first one says the benefits of adverse effects of drinking milk. Okay, so we want to know if drinking milk is good or bad. Okay, so one source is a pamphlet from an animal rights group that opposes dairy farming, and the second source is Canada's food guide produced by Health Canada. So the more reliable source would be Health Canada, right? Because they are a neutral, well, not always neutral, but they're supposed to be a neutral organization that is going to give you reliable information. A animal rights group is obviously going to have a biased opinion, right? They don't believe in drinking milk, so they're going to give you their side of the story and not the other side. So Health Canada would be the more reliable source. So really on these, you're just deciding which source would be better. The second one, it says effects of logging on the population of a bird species. So cutting down trees affecting birds population. So one is a pamphlet from a wildlife protection organization, and the other one is a forestry company ad. Which one do you think is better? So one is a pamphlet from a wildlife protection, and the other one is a forestry company. I would tend to say the wildlife protection is a better source. They probably have more information. A forestry company is interested in cutting down trees, right? They're interested in getting that wood. So I would say that the wildlife is the better source. And then the third one is possible complications of flu shots. Oh, this is relevant. So that question is coming up now. If a vaccine comes out, are you going to get it or not? Right? So do we get a flu shot? I don't get a flu shot. A lot of people believe in it. Some people don't. But there are some research information about, whether it's beneficial or not. One source is the Ministry of Health, and the other one is a website run by a group that opposes immunization. So obviously the Ministry of Health website is the better source. So all you're looking for with reliable data is the information being presented unbiased, right? You don't want one opinion or another. You want a neutral opinion. So this one is in the guide. Some of the questions: decide which data source is more likely to produce reliable data. Justify your answer. So the first one is sound quality of a stereo. And we have an ad in a magazine, and then we have a review in a consumer magazine. So probably the review is better because someone has actually used the product and has an opinion, whereas an ad really is there just to sell it. So that's probably not as reliable. The second one is the side effects of a medication. So a health information website run by a hospital or a blog written by someone who has taken. I would probably tend to think that the hospital would be a more reliable source. And then the third one is job prospects in a particular field. A PDF document by the Ontario Ministry of Training and Colleges, or a brochure you received in the mail. So obviously the Ministry of Training is the better source. Okay. The margin of error is in there. So a margin of error tells you how many percent points your results will be different from the real population. So for example, a 95% confidence interval with a 4% margin of error means that your statistics will be within 4% of the real population 95% of the time. So what does that mean? That means that when we do a survey or a poll, we can't exactly say, well, 90% of the people think that's true, right? Because there's always a little bit of leeway on either side, right? It's the same as when you buy a bag of chips and they say there's 500 grams in that bag. There's never exactly 500, right? So there's this calculation called standard deviation. We're not going to do standard deviation, but this is similar to standard deviation. So standard deviation says here's the middle and then give or take, right? So I would expect that bag to have maybe between 520 or 480 grams, and I would be happy, right? A little bit more, a little bit less, so around 500. If it only had 300 grams, I would not be happy. If there was 600 grams, I'd be super happy, right? So that's what the margin of error is, that when you gather the data and your results, it means that there's going to be a little bit of error. It's not going to be exactly correct. So this one says a poll might report that a candidate is going to win an election with 51% of the vote. The confidence level is 95%, and the error is 4%. So that means when we take our results, we expect it to be 51% give or take. So if I subtract 4%, I get 47, and if I add, I get 55. So I would expect my results to be between 47 and 55%, right? So that's the accuracy that I would expect it to have. The 95% means that 95% of the time I would expect that result, okay? So that's what that means. So here we have a survey. 1,000 Canadians were asked about the toys that they buy, and this is their responses. So we have a little, oh, my brain is not working today. We have a little legend here, right, telling us what each. So the gray is certain. So it says, please say whether you are certain to, likely to, unlikely to, or not certain to avoid toys made in China. Right? So 30% of the people said they would certain to avoid buying toys made in China. 25% they would be likely to avoid it. 25% would unlikely to avoid it. 13% are not going to avoid it. And then 6% don't know. Okay, so don't have an opinion. Okay, so the question was, are you going to avoid toys made in China? That's the question. What percent said they were certain or likely? So certain or likely to avoid. So I'm just going to add up these percent. So 30% said they were certain to, and 25% said they were likely to. So 55% would most likely not buy a toy from China. The poll's margin of error is 3.1%, 19 times out of 20. What does that mean? That means that the results, so for example, 3.1% margin of error. So let's say we took the certain, people who were certain not to buy it, 30%. The margin of error is 3.1%. So I'm going to add 3.1 and subtract 3.1. Because the 30% is sort of an estimate, right? So if I add 3.1 and subtract, so I subtract, it would be 26.9, and I add. So my margin of error indicates that the number of people certain to not buy will be between 26.9 and 33.1, right? So not exactly 30, give or take that margin of error. So that's how accurate my results are. And the 19 times out of 20 means 19 times out of 20, I would expect this margin of error, okay? All right, so that's your reliability of your data. And then the next part is talking about surveys. I don't think I'm going to get you guys to do a survey. Normally we would do a survey in school. So you would create a question, you would go ask some students, and then get your results. I'll just give you some data. So what we would do, normally we have you create a survey, collect the results, plot it on a graph, find a line of best fit, and then answer some questions from that line of best fit. But since we don't have anybody here, I'll probably give you the information and then we'll just use that, okay? So there's a bit of information there about what an effective survey looks like. So it says they're designed with the purpose of generating accurate and detailed information, and you have to make sure that the people taking the survey are comfortable answering the questions. So 3 things you need to think about with a survey. One is ethics, right? So ethics means that you have a responsibility to keep the person informed. So you must have an introduction on your survey to let them know what the survey is about. You must make sure that the people answering the survey are willing to answer it, right? They're not being forced into answering it. You must keep it confidential, and you cannot disclose any personal information. So a lot of times you'll see these in emails and that. They say that this is confidential and that your personal information will not be shared, okay? The second thing you have to make sure is that you want to make sure that the people taking the survey are being honest. So if we keep the answers confidential, they're more likely to give you an honest answer when they know it's not going to be shared. In the multiple choice, you want to also include answers that I don't know or it's not applicable to me or others, so that there's always an option if there's nothing there that they see as relevant. Rating scales are like a scale from 1 to 5, or least likely and most likely. Those are what rating scales are. So you want to make sure that they're clear and offer a good range. Don't ask too many questions that are the same or that makes the person think too hard. And the difficult or sensitive questions you should keep to the end of the survey. And then the third thing you want to look at is eliminating bias. So bias is when you have one opinion or another. You don't want to lead them. You want it to be neutral, right? So you want to avoid questions that kind of lead them to an answer, right? You want their honest opinion. You don't want them to be biased one way or the other. Questions should be neutral. If you have a rating scale, it should be in order, right? So excellent to very good to poor. And then you have to determine what's the most appropriate way to deliver the survey. Is it, a face-to-face interview? Should I do it over the internet, telephone, or email? Okay. So those are things you want to think about when you're creating your survey. All right. I have to click down here. Okay, so this is in the guide. The first part is not in the guide, but this is in your guide. So this is just a bit of vocabulary. So what a survey is a collection, tool, or list of questions used to gather information. The population is the individuals in the group who are going to take the survey. For example, the population of Westmount would be a good population to survey. A sample is a group of individuals that are representative of the population. So if we want to represent Westmount, let's say we wanted to see what the students at Westmount's favorite thing in the cafeteria was, we wouldn't probably ask every single Westmount student, right? It would take too long. So we might take a sample of that. So maybe we'll ask 100 students, right? So that 100 people are a sample of the actual population. And then sample size can affect a survey. You don't want it too small. Like if I only ask 10 people at Westmount, then my information probably isn't very accurate because I only asked 10 people. And maybe I only asked my 10 friends, right? So that is not a very good sample size. If it's too big, it might cost too much money, okay? So you also want the sample to be representative of the population. So the example given is if we wanted to look at Canadians' opinion of something and we only surveyed people from Atlantic Canada, that's not going to be reflective of all Canadians because you're only looking at one sort of sample. So there's a list in there of different techniques to sample. So when you get your task, you're going to be asked to classify samples, right? So how do we sample things? So the first one is just a simple random sampling. That means as people walked in the door, I would just randomly pick somebody, or at the mall, I would just randomly pick someone, okay? A stratified is taking a sample from each group. So we're going to put people in groups. So for example, if I wanted to survey Westmount, I would probably, we could easily divide Westmount by grade, right? So grade 9, 10, 11, 12, and then I would take an equal sample from each grade. So that's what a stratified sample is taking an equal sample from each grade. Cluster sampling is organized into groups. So maybe you go into the CAF and we take a group from each table. Maybe there's a table here and a table here, so we'll ask a couple of people at each table. Or if it was Hamilton, we might ask people from certain neighborhoods. So we might go down to Westdale and ask somebody from there. We might come up on the mountain and ask a bunch of people there, so that we're looking at samples from different clusters. Systematic is when you sample or ask every so many people, right? So maybe I'm standing at the front door at Westmount and I'm going to ask every 10th person that comes in. That's a systematic sampling. Or maybe at the mall, I might ask every, 5th person I walk by. Convenience is when they're surveyed just because it's convenient for that thing. So maybe you're at a concert and you're there, right? So it's convenient to sample you there. So that's, or maybe you're at a TICAT game. This is the one. Regarding their opinion on a New Jersey, that would be convenient because they're at the game. They're obviously interested in the TICATs, and they would be a good sample to ask. Judgment is, we don't really use this one much. It's just when the person conducting the survey uses their judgment to create a representative sample. And voluntary is you are being questioned because you volunteered, right? You volunteered to answer the survey, okay? So those are the different types of samples you could use. There are 5 types of questions that you can ask in a survey. So one is a rating scale, so from least to greatest, so least likely to most likely, excellent to poor. Completion is just fill in the blank, just put an answer in. Open-ended is where you can give a longer answer and give more of an opinion. You could have a multiple choice. And then dichotomous is really a 2-part. It's either yes or no, true or false, right? That's what dichotomous is, di being meaning 2. Okay, so this is an example of a survey. It was handed out to every 10th customer at a coffee shop. So what kind of survey is that? If it's handed out to every 10th customer, it's a systematic sampling, right? That's what it would be classified about. So if you were asked to classify this survey, you would say it is a stratified survey. All right, let me get back to here. Okay, so I'm just going to write that in here. Every 10th, it is a stratified. Okay, analyze the survey for honest responses and bias. Make any changes that would improve the survey. So the first question asked is, what is your age? Okay, so you might want to make that better by putting in an age range, because some people might not want to say specifically their age. So you might want to put some range. Right, so maybe I'm 20 and younger, or between 20 and 40, or between 40 and older is probably more likely to give you an honest answer. Male or female, well, that's a little restricted by gender because not everybody is male or female, right? So you want more options for that. Right, so you might say male, female, or other, right? Because some people are undecided. How many cups of coffee do you drink in one day? So this is probably pretty good. You might want to add none, right? Because maybe you don't drink coffee, you drink tea. So coffee is specific to one drink. So less than 2, 3 to 5 or more. You put more than 5. I might add more than 5 just to be specific. And then I would also add in none because maybe you don't drink coffee, Okay? So you have to have options for everybody. Rate each beverage from extreme dislike to extremely enjoy. So we've got a good rating scale, right? 1 to 5, and it's pretty clear about what each one is representing, and it's in order. You might want to look at the drinks being asked about. Maybe it needs to be a bigger option, right? Maybe there's other drinks that need to be included. So that's debatable. And then the last question is, how do you like the service at the shop? You might want to change it to a rating, right, rather than writing it down. Or you might want to say, add, do you have any suggestions, right, to improve our service, rather than how do you like the service? So I would either do a rating or a more specific question. Like, people sometimes don't want to write things out. So if it says, how do you like the service? I might say, would you return, right? Would you return, yes or no? Or would you recommend our service to another person, yes or no, right? So that's easy to circle rather than asking for an opinion. And it's a little bit vague, okay? So there's always ways to improve surveys. So the next part of the guide is just looking at types of surveys, looking at whether they're honest and unbiased surveys, and then also about margin of error, okay? So the next part of the guide, I will give you some data to use, and we're going to look at how do we take this data, plot it on a scatter plot, because we did scatter plots earlier, right, in the guide, finding the line of best fit, finding the equation of that line, and then being able to use that information to come up with some results or some answers, okay?